I am going to talk about this idea of open APIs. And by open, I mean not necessarily free, not necessarily without any security, but public might be a synonym that you can use as we talk about this. And I love APIs because APIs provide this blank canvas that anyone can use to create something completely new. Who else loves APIs for that reason? Anyone? Okay, all right, lots of hands, that's good. For those of you who didn't raise your hands, let me try again. I love APIs because they're a building block that you can plug into, take some very specific functionality and plug it into yours. Who loves APIs for that reason? Okay, I think there were some overlaps there, and that's okay, because I love it for both of those reasons as well. So when I got to thinking about who is it that uses a canvas, who is it that uses building blocks, I think of two professions here, the artist and the architect. And I'm sure that Europe is more enlightened than the States, but in the States there's kind of a stigma against the professional artist, right? There's the stereotype of the starving artist. And I think that in some ways we've seen that play out in the API space with the API as canvas. But really, technology and art have always been very, very close together. Who remembers when we used to produce books like this? Okay, that's good. Not one hand. That was a test to see if anyone would raise their hand when I raised my hand. But really, for many, many years, this is how books were created. And then, of course, some technology came along, technology that expanded the reach, technology that allowed anyone to share what they were creating. And fast forward a bit, the printing press wasn't available to everyone, and then came desktop publishing and the personal computer. And now many more people could share their creativity, technology enabling creativity. And fast forward again to the web and to WordPress. And now you have a WordPress installation, and it is kind of like a blank canvas that you can add your thoughts to. And in a way, WordPress is also has building blocks, has the plugin architecture. And so that's similar in a way to the two ways that APIs are able to enable creativity and able to enable new businesses. Because remember, as we went along there with technology enabling creativity, it also enabled brand new businesses. And so those are the things that excite me about APIs. And of course, as we all know, there are a lot of them. This is ProgrammableWeb's chart from 2005 to earlier this year. And actually that, of course, has continued to go up, and it's darn near 10,000 now. And so I wanted to talk some about before this chart starts. What were some of the first APIs, and how did they approach it? So eBay started, I think, in 2000, made it available for anyone to be able to add auctions and search auctions that were in the eBay website. And so this created a whole ecosystem of power seller tools, and a ton of eBay's revenue still comes through its API. Salesforce, also very early on, recognizing that it made sense to allow people to build on top of what they had. And then Amazon, of course. Amazon has many APIs now, but its first one, also very early in the 2000s, allowed you to search from its vast database of products and be able to make money yourself as a developer by making them money. Then, of course, who remembers mashup mania I think you guys are just tired of raising your arms now at this point. That's okay. So these are two sites from the early days of that. Housing Maps, which took Craigslist's apartment listings and put them on a map, and Chicago Crime. And the cool thing about both of these is that they existed before the Google Maps API. So Google Maps came out, and everyone thought it was really great how you could have pins and slippy map, right? And they thought it was so great that they reverse engineered the way it was built and allowed it to be embedded. And in many ways, I think inspired the Google Maps API that now exists on millions of websites. And of course, once the official one came out, tons of these sites. And this is the ultimate blank canvas. A couple years later, Facebook allowed you to create your app and put it into their site. And this again led to a bunch of apps being built. And it also led to this idea, along with Google Maps, that putting an API out there and just spreading it wide leads to this wonderful world where everything is perfect and everyone uses your app and you instantly make money based upon that. And of course, we know now, having seen thousands of examples of these, that sometimes it ends up looking a little bit more like this. And I think that's because it's not one size fits all. What works for Google Maps doesn't necessarily work for whatever your product is. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a possibility for an API, but there are some times where it just doesn't align with, say, new ownership. In this case, you have the Punchfork API, which gets shut down when it was bought by Pinterest. And acquisitions happen like that, where Punchfork had one approach, they're acquired, and it's a completely different approach. And of course, sometimes within the same company, the approach changes. Twitter has changed the way it's approached its API and has realized that its business model isn't impacted by being spread as wide as possible. And then Netflix, its API program started by allowing you to search its database of DVDs at the time, which led to its streaming database. And it found out that it got more value from that API by using it in internal applications. So there are over 1,000 devices now that can play Netflix, that can stream Netflix, and those all use the Netflix API. And so by Netflix discontinuing its public program, it showed that they were going to focus in, they were going to zero on the part of the API program that made sense for them. And then Google, we talk about its many APIs and about it being maybe the poster child of the blank canvas approach. It has, in the last few years, closed down a bunch of its APIs, recognizing that they no longer worked with the approach it wanted for that. And there have actually been 33 Google API shutdowns, which is more than most companies have APIs. But Google, of course, has created well over 100 APIs that it has made public. But even some of its APIs that are still public are approaching it in a different way. I wrote a book on mapping APIs and used to say that it makes sense to have the opportunity to use more than one API, because someday Google might put ads on it on the map, or someday they might charge for it. They do both now. And so this shows that even Google's vast resources, at some point they had to say, completely providing this wide open and public doesn't fit with our business model. It costs a lot to serve that many maps. So back in those early Google Maps days, a lot of people used to ask this question: should I have an API? And I think it's a question we don't hear as much anymore. And the reason is because everyone already has an API. Anyone with a mobile app that does anything interesting is sending data between the client and the server. That takes an API. Travis alluded to that a little bit at the beginning. And so now the question is not, should I have an API, but should I open my API? Does it make sense, or in what way does it make sense to make my API available to others? Well, sometimes they make it open for you. That was the case with Instagram. Instagram, before it was a $1 billion acquisition, it was a really hot new mobile app for sharing photos. And so someone with great skin sniffed the traffic that's going between the app and the server, and reverse engineered the Instagram API, much like the early days of Google Maps. And the timeline went a little bit like this. That was in December of 2010. So they reverse engineered it, documented it. People started building things on this Instagram API, this private Instagram API. Well, a month later, Instagram said no, and they found a way to shut down and make sure that only their app worked. But they said, okay, we've heard you. We'll think about this. They didn't think about it very long, because the next month they started taking signups for their public beta. And of course, now Instagram has a public API, and it allows their content to spread. Doesn't always go in that same trajectory. So Google Plus was released, and quite instantly people said, this needs an API. And many people created unofficial APIs for it. So that was in July 2011. It felt like a lot longer, but just a couple months later, Google released an API, but it was read-only and only for public data. Now, if you think about that, they're approaching that in a way that was very intentional, to be able to look at what they wanted from their service, Google Plus, and to release an API that supported that. And then, a year after its release, and now 2 years after its release, it's still no writable API in the way that developers want it to be, because Google's staying true to what their service is. And I think maybe they learned a lesson from their first API. Their first API in the early 2000s, again, was for getting at search results. Makes sense. They're a search company, have a search API. And it was a popular API, but they realized that it didn't fit within the user experience that they wanted for their search results. And maybe the business model that they'd created for monetizing those search results. And so that API was shut down. So that's one of those 33. So I know I dodged this a little bit, maybe explained it a bit at the beginning, but this idea of what is open. And many times there's a misconception that open means completely free and available to anyone. And for my definition, and the definition that I used at ProgrammableWeb is the directory expanded, those are not the case. Some are, but those are not always the case. And the best way, it's a complete cop-out, the best way I've come to describe it, open, is not closed. But I would like today to show you some open signs. Okay, how about some signs of open APIs? So there are 3 signs of open APIs that I look for. One is that it's acknowledged, right? The company that provides it has to say, this is an API. It is available. It has to be documented. They have to explain, how would you use this API? How can you? And then it has to be supported. There must be someone that you can talk to about this API. And if you have all three of those things, or even at the very least one of those things, then I think you have an open API. And now there are certainly varying ways of doing this to where it's better, and I have a whole other talk on that, which I call the 3 C's: cost, clarity, and community, the 3 things that you'd look for in an open developer program. You can find that at bit.ly/the3Cs. And I'll make my slides available afterwards so you can find that as well. So having an API that is acknowledged, documented, and supported, what benefits can that provide the company? I'd like to tell one story about Twilio. Familiar with Twilio, the SMS and voice API? So Twilio has a big partnership in Intuit. So Twilio, in comparison, is a much smaller company. Intuit, huge, processes payroll for millions of employees. Well, at Intuit, there was an employee that I like to call Mary. And Mary was sort of tinkering with Twilio on a Friday afternoon, thinking, this is interesting. And so over the weekend, she goes home, she reads more, she signs up, doesn't have to talk to anyone. And she realizes this could really be useful for something that we do now in a much more manual way. If you're doing processing payroll, you have to verify that they're a person. So they do a phone call to the person who they're adding. Well, Intuit would have to have their own sort of infrastructure to be able to do that, except that instead they can use Twilio. They make a call to Twilio, an HTTP call to Twilio, and then Twilio makes a phone call to this guy who I didn't bother naming, but you can give him whatever name you would like. And through magic there, Twilio has a big API partner. Now, Twilio charges a penny a minute for voice, something like that. But when you have a big customer like Intuit, that adds up. That adds up to a big partnership. And Twilio is an example of a new type of API that has sprouted up and expanded, that it very much gets to kind of the building block that we talked about, and that is the API as a product, where the API is the company. That's certainly the case with SendGrid, who I work for now, with email, Twilio for voice, Urban Airship for push, a bunch of companies for storage. Certainly, you've seen the explosion in computing, and there are just a bunch more that don't fit on this slide. And so that is an example of one type of business model that has grown a lot in the API space, but it's only one of the 4 basic business models. Free, you have to have that for some. It makes sense for some like Facebook. Developer pays, so that's the API as product business model in many cases. Then developer gets paid, and then some indirect methods. And this is actually just the top section of a much larger graph by John Musser from ProgrammableWeb, who I know was sorry that he couldn't attend and tell you about all these business models himself. But there are so many options in here. And again, if you want a larger version of it, there's a bit.ly here for API biz models, and you can kind of dig into those examples. And actually that slide that goes to is part of a larger talk that he gives. So as you look at these different business models here, you'll see that some are make more sense kind of as a canvas. Some of them make more sense as blocks. And perhaps some of the more successful are less canvassy and more blocky. So does that mean, though, that the utopian world of open APIs, ones that anyone can access, is over. I don't think it does. And an Instagram example again is one of the ways that that I think is showing that we have a future that maybe is even more public than currently. So there used to be a feature in Instagram where you could find friends on Twitter by connecting to Twitter. Well, Twitter, not what you thought, right? Twitter dropped a bomb on Instagram by removing that API feature. Because Instagram was purchased by Facebook, it's a competitor, they removed that feature. You're saying, I thought you were going to say something positive about the future of public APIs, right? The positive thing there is that users got very upset. Instagram had taken away this feature. This is the first time that I remember where the general public demanded an API. They didn't say it by name, they didn't call it an API, and they may never, but listen for people asking for integrations, and they're really asking for APIs. And I think the more that they see these features, the more that they will recognize that companies need to provide them. There's another great way that people are asking for APIs. So FreshBooks is an accounting software. And they looked at, so it's freemium, so they have a free account and then a paid account. And they realized that if someone was using an integration, an API, that they were much more likely to convert from the free account to the paid account. So there you have an API that no one is charging for, but that people are making money off of based on these integrations. And then this huge number of coming connected things that Travis mentioned, and there's a panel later this afternoon about it. And there are going to be many more of these, all collecting data, sharing data, and people are going to want them to work together. They're going to want to be able to take, in these cases, their health data and put it in one place. And so they'll be asking for that. They'll be asking for that, maybe not by the term API, but they'll be asking for that. And we've got a few new ways for people to be able to actually integrate APIs without being programmers. The top one here is If This Then That, and then Zapier, and they both have a collection of APIs that you can build actions off of, and you can say when there's something new here, put it over here. So being able to make that connection, and the users of these are mostly non-developers. And so being able to make that connection, I think, will, again, make people ask for APIs. And I want to leave you with a final thought before you say that American hates art. I want you to think that, sometimes the building block can also be a canvas. And for many, many years, of course, regardless of whether there's a mural on it, architecture has been an art form. And I think both will play out in the API world.
You made a talk about open APIs mainly. So my question is, you said Google shut down 33 APIs, Twitter shut down access to LinkedIn, to Instagram. So many change. For example, one month ago, LinkedIn made new term of services that cuts a job notifier application and kill a startup. And last year it was Pilk, a French startup. So API changes exactly in the way that maybe companies make default about paying, for example. So do you think for open APIs we need a kind of standard and poors of rating open APIs based on API default like Google or other ones?
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of what we're seeing right now is maybe some backtracking at companies who opened those APIs before they had fully thought about how it would be used. So I think now, as you see APIs come out, Google Plus is a recent example where they, instead of going out and allowing a bunch and then having to backtrack, they're slowly inching out. I think, though, if a company is too closed, that you'll see some backlash from no one wanting to develop against it at all, and from users not wanting to use something that doesn't work with the rest of the web and the rest of the world. So whether there should be a place that rates them, I'm not sure. I think that some of that will happen no matter what, with just kind of talk around the developer water coolers about how open, how public an API is.
SendGrid send emails.
Right.
There were APIs for sending emails long before SendGrid.
Right.
Similarly, SMS was, when Twilio launched in 2007, an old technology already.
Right. Yeah.
And now Twilio is a massive carrier of SMS.
Right.
I'm interested to know how those companies, given that the API side of what they were doing wasn't particularly imaginative, came to be so dominant. And I'm asking from the perspective of a company that's at the moment trying to start a platform for essentially an API for video devices, for cameras. So
Yeah.
how do I go about being Twilio, SendGrid, etc.?
Right, yeah. So those two examples, you're right, built on top of technology that already existed, but technology that was very hard to use. And so each of them really focused on making it much simpler to be able to integrate with. So in the case of SendGrid, we noticed that, or our founders noticed that email wasn't getting delivered. And so that was the problem that was fixed, is that let's make it easy. Let's not change how a developer sends email. If they don't want to, they don't have to use the web API. You can just use SMTP. So with Twilio, it's a much bigger problem in that there are all of these telcos to connect, and to be able to do that and provide a modern layer to be able to do that is big. With cameras, I spoke to your co-founder last night, and with cameras, I think that the difficulty there is that not everyone owns that piece of hardware, so it's harder to simplify that. But the fact that there are so many different types of cameras, I think, provides the opportunity for that same simplification. If you had one way to access any type of camera, that's certainly a great spot for an API as product. And Mark Andreessen says that software is eating the world, and I think the API as product is a real great example of that happening.
So I was thinking, all these companies who had their APIs open, and then when they saw what people were doing, they decided to shut them down or make them less open. What's your tip for a company who's planning to, a bigger company who's planning to implement APIs? Is that a good strategy to leave it open and see what people do, or do you prefer that you should have kind of a business model up front?
Yeah, you should definitely think about how the business model, how your current business model works with an API. So rarely, I think, would a company start an API and have a new business model for that API. So it should, you look back at the early examples I gave of eBay and Salesforce, they already had their business models, and those APIs added on to those business models. If you're a big company getting started, I think the best way is to dog food it. Are you familiar with that term? Drink your own champagne. And that is to use it internally and really iterate there. I saw more and more APIs launching as version 2 or version 3. You can see that in the versioning of it, and you think that this is the first time I've seen it. That's because the early versions were used entirely internally, and then maybe out to select private partners, right? So I think that's a good way to get started, so that when you do find a way to go completely public, that it benefits your company. Yeah. All right. Thank you all very much, and I'll look forward to talking about it more. Yeah, thanks.